Hey everybody, welcome to U7-L2 Intro to Middle Age Europe. Yeah, I had to switch like the Chrome extension that I use to sometimes my camera works and sometimes it doesn't. I guess it's just not working. That's okay. So your job, you're going to watch this Ed puzzle, answer the questions that I just want you to answer on the Ed puzzle will be in blue text. Any important concept will be in red text. And of course, you have questions. Email your teacher, come to office hours. We're here to help you. Learning targets, compare and contrast the cultures in Eastern and Western Europe, including the impact of disease and climate change. Today, we're going to talk mostly about just everyday peasant life in the Middle Ages. But throughout the unit, we'll also touch on things like the Black Death, Byzantine Empire, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Roman Catholicism, which we'll also talk about the Roman Catholic Church today as well. So here's a screenshot of what our calendar is for Unit 7, and as you might have guessed, or maybe it's a surprise to you, it takes us all the way to the end of the second semester. Yay! That's pretty exciting. Yep, last unit of the semester. So just note that the semester ends on January 25th. So we'll start here on the top. So of course you have your study guide. That is going to be due. This is kind of a change, so pay attention. This is due Thursday, January 25th. Okay, so January 25th is the last day of the semester. You don't have school on the 26th. So the Unit 7 test, along with your Unit 7 study guide, will be due Thursday, the 25th at midnight. There will not be exceptions to that. If you do not turn it in, it's a 0. Okay, so make sure you get that turned in. So today we're going over the Intro to Middle Age Europe. I'll talk about what you do next, which is just the video choice. And then on Friday, you'll do Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. The next week, we'll be talking about women in the Middle Ages and also the Eastern Orthodox Church. Here's your primary source reading. It is a fairy tale that a woman wrote. It's called Bisclarvet. It's pretty cool. It's not boring like some of the other readings are. And then for lessons 7, 8, and 9, these are a History Channel video that you'll watch and answer the questions directly on the Ed puzzle. So that's kind of nice that it's a break away from one of my videos. The 15th, you don't have school. So on the 16th, it's another Power of the Church Ed puzzle, which is one I do. Unit 7, L11, that is going to be the Crusades Part 1 and 2. So we learn about the Crusades. Then after that, you learn about the Black Death. And then for lesson 13, this one is a reading about England and France and the 100 Years' War, and we also talk about Joan of Arc a little bit into that reading. And then it takes you all the way to the last week of school. So this whole last week of school, so the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th of January, I have dedicated just for you to do your Unit 7 test. That's literally it in those 4 days. It's a multiple choice test, by the way. It's not a project like I've been making you do for the last 3 units. And also just make sure that you know that there is no test corrections with the Unit 7 test. So make sure that you get a good score your first time around because there are no test corrections since it's the end of the semester. I'll also post the optional Kahoot, which is a really good study tool. And there's also be another extra credit option with a video about Joan of Arc. So yeah, pretty neat. So kind of like I said before, well, actually, I didn't say this part, but there is no like cumulative test that we're going to give you. The final test is just simply the Unit 7 test. So we're not going back into like units 1 through 6. It's just going to be purely Unit 7. Again, study guide and the Unit 7 test are due Thursday, the 25th at midnight. If you don't turn it in by them, it's a 0. And once again, test corrections. So, do you have any questions about the Unit 7 calendar and what we'll be doing? If you don't have any, just type none. All right, let's start our slideshow. All right, so when we talk about the Middle Ages, some people might refer to as the Medieval Ages, some people might refer to as the Dark Ages, whoever says what. It all means the same thing. So I usually keep it pretty consistent when I say Middle Ages, but all three of these mean the same thing. But here's my question for you. When you think of the Middle Ages, what do you think of? All right, so you might think of the Crusades. You might think of peasants, which we'll talk about a lot today. Crusades will come later. You might think of cool castles that you still can go visit in Europe today. Maybe you think about suit of armors. You might think of like some crazy cool art with ladies with like long dresses and like interesting hats and unicorns. That's always a fun one. You might think of religion during this time, and you might think about the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Plague or the Black Death, which we'll also learn about in this unit. So, how did we get to the Middle Ages? How did we get here? So, we talked about before in Unit 4 the Roman Empire. So that ended in 330 CE. Again, there was various reasons that the Roman Empire ended, such as being really hard to govern because it was really big, as you can see here on this map. Also, invasions of foreign people, economic hardships, and the rise of Christianity. We talked all about those. Uh, After the Roman Empire, over here in kind of more the Asia side, so where like Constantinople is, that rose the Byzantine Empire, which was from 330 to 1453. We'll talk about it throughout this whole unit. But just once again, to kind of recap, it was founded by Constantine after the Roman Empire split into two. They were also a major supporter of Christianity, um, and their capital was Constantinople, which is right here on the map. So here's kind of a timeline that I drew up. So we have here, right, the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire ends about right here in 330. That's where the Byzantine Empire starts coming in. In Middle East and North Africa in 610, we talked about Islam. That's where that's going to start beginning, is about right here in the time period. Um, The Byzantine Empire also overlaps pretty closely with the Middle Ages, which is from about 500 to 1500. And then, of course, you will see down here that the Renaissance, which is our next unit that we'll start off semester 2 with, overlaps with the Middle Ages as well. And you can see here, like the Mongol Empire. So when we talked about Genghis Khan a few units ago, that would be right here. And it's really kind of interesting to note too, like we think about the Middle Ages, they're like, oh my God, that was so long ago. Like those people, lived forever and ever and ever ago. I mean, which they did, right? It was like over 500 years ago. But to put it a little bit into perspective, so with the Middle Ages right here, so it ends roughly about 1500. Only 3 years later did Ponce de Leon, who was a famous explorer, he lands in Florida. Like, yeah, like the Florida, like the US Florida, like the white sand Florida in 1503. So there's only about a 3 year gap between the age of exploration and the Middle Ages, which is kind of crazy to think about. And then Jamestown, Virginia, which is one of the first like towns in North America that were European, that's in 1607. I mean, kind of crazy. Think how kind of close all these events are. And then, of course, there's us today. All right, so the Byzantine Empire, they really saw the Western European people as hopeless, okay? Um, so they saw that there was lots of different tribes, especially like from where modern day Germany is and stuff, that were trying to invade Roman land. So the Byzantine Empire, which again was located in Constantinople, was like, hey, Western Europe, you're just too much of like a liability. We're just going to abandon you and focus on our Eastern Europe empire, is what they did in 568 CE. Hence why West and East Europe really split, because one side to the west was just kind of like a bunch of different tribes. There wasn't really any unity. And to the east, of Europe, like in what modern day Greece is and Turkey, um, that is where the Byzantine Empire is, and they're a lot more unified. So the Byzantine Empire, they were just like, hey, we're just going to leave the city of Rome. They're going to have to fend for themselves. So they literally just abandoned their symbol of being a continuation of the Roman Empire. because they abandoned the main city of Rome and moved all their stuff to Constantinople. But there's a really big problem with that. The Christian church's leader, which is the Pope, was still located in Rome. And the Pope was really not happy about that because he's like, hey, Byzantine Empire, you totally just abandoned me. And we'll talk about the popes did for revenge later when we talk about King Pepin. So literally, here's like the Pope in Rome. He's like, wow, thanks for ditching me. And the Byzantine Empire is like, you're too much to handle, Western Europe. Go fend for yourselves. Love your pal, the Byzantine Empire. Anyway, all right, so for now, we're just talking solely about the Western Europe. And we'll talk more about Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire in lesson 5. So, speaking of the Western Empire or the Western Europe, in the Middle Ages, um, it was a mess. So, European countries and kingdoms were in constant fluctuation. Like you can see here on the map, all the different colors, those all represent different kingdoms. And borders were always moving due to battles for land and rivalries between kingdoms. So, they were totally not unified. There's so much information to learn about the Middle Ages. What we'll focus on this unit is feudalism and serfdom and peasants, which is what today's is. Charlemagne, women in Middle Ages, and then everyday life for peasants and knights. So let's start with peasants. So what is a peasant? A peasant is a poor farmer who owns a small piece of land or rents it from a lord. They can also be called serfs. Sometimes textbooks refer to them as serfs. And then what is a lord? A lord is just a wealthy landowner. So he could either be a knight, which is like a high ranking soldier, or he could be part of the nobility, so like a baron, count, or duke. And they would live in a large countryside house called a manor. So peasants and lords worked under the social system of feudalism. So feudalism can pretty much be wrapped up right here in the social pyramid. So lords, which are right here in kind of like this purpley blue color, they are the vassals to the king. So the king is at the very top. Below them is the lords. So a vassal is someone who works under a higher authority. So the lords swear their allegiance to the king. And then the lords are the ones who are overseeing the knights as well as the peasants with their farmland. Okay, so you can see here that up above is the kings, then after that is the lords. The king looks after the lords look after the knights, and the knights look after kind of the peasants, but so do the lords. So it's a little flop there, but anyway. All right, so 9 out of 10 people in Europe were peasants in the Middle Ages. Um, so people became peasants due to the lords and church owning most of the farming land. So these just everyday people, they couldn't afford to buy land because the lords and church had a monopoly on it. So the middle class in Europe pretty much just completely disappears. So if you were randomly born into your in medieval society, you'd either be a peasant, an industrial labor, a miner, a craftsman, or if you're really, really lucky, you could be a noble or a priest. So life as a peasant was duper sad. They rented the land to farm from the Lord. In return, they give the Lord the majority of their harvest as like a tax. They also bought tools from their lord. They bought clothes and other household items from the lord. And they rented houses from the lord. So, what do you think is the problem with the relationship between peasants and their. Yeah, so peasants bought and rented everything from a lord. So the lord could just totally increase prices or demand more and anytime he liked. There was no laws, there's no rules, there's no regulations. So they pretty much just would suck the peasants dry of the money. So peasants would labor 54 hours a week. That include both men and women. And for women, on top of that, they had to take care of the kids. So lords would live in manors, which are large stone houses or castles in the countryside. Here's an example of one in England. Anywhere between 15 to 30 peasants lived in a one-room wooden house. Yes, one room. Could have up to 30 people. Crazy. They also didn't have any education. and they were not allowed to leave the Lord's land. They had to stay in their village. Even if they tried to run away, the Lord would send out their knights, and the knights would be capture the peasants and brought back to the farm. And the average lifespan of peasants was about 35 years old. So here's kind of a map of what a manor would look like. So there's usually a church. There's the mill for like grinding up the wheat. There's all the fields around it. You can see the manor house is the nicest house, and then all the little sad cottages are kind of like in this little village. So here's another question. Why do you think the lords didn't want the peasants to interact with other lords' villages and towns? It was all about control. So lords wanted full control over peasants. So peasants would not go to town. That meant no trading of ideas. Peasants were also not educated, so they couldn't read and write letters and spread those around with ideas as well. So again, it's all about control. In 950, that's when the Earth started to warm too during the medieval ages. We'll get to why in a second. But what this led to is a warmer climate led to more land that could be farmed, which led to more food, which led to like a population boom, which led to more mouths could be fed, which led to more people. Um, so in about 1100 to 1445, the population of Europe doubled. And old farming practices couldn't sustain the population growth anymore. So this had to come into place. It's called the three field system. I don't have this actually highlighted as a vocab word, but it is just kind of important to know in like the revolution of agriculture. So what a peasant farmer would do is they would take their field, they'd split it up into three equal sections. They would only plant two of the sections and let one of the sections rest to kind of like regain nutrients in the soil. And then the next year, they would like plant crops in like two of the sections and let a different section rest. And then in year three, they would finally let the last section rest and plant crops in the other two sections. So they would rotate which field got to rest and which. All right, so most of the crops that were planted included wheat, rye, oats, barley, and legumes. Legumes are kind of like beans or peas. They also invented the karauka. I don't know if I said that right, but it means just a deep plow. So the really cool thing about plows during the Middle Ages is that like down here where like the tip where the soil like where it digs into the soil is made out of metal, so it could dig several inches into the ground to plant the seeds. It was typically pulled by horses or oxen, so they'd be hooked up right here, and then there would be a person right here where the handlebars are. Oxen were slower than horses but a lot cheaper. Wind and water mills have been an invention since the Roman Empire. Investors and lords would build these mills in towns or villages. Um, the really sad part of it is that peasants had to pay the lords to use the mill. So let's say a peasant's like, hey, I have some wheat. I wanted to grind it up and make it into flour so I can feed my family bread. The lord will be like, well, that'll cost you. So you better pay up, which is really cheap on the Lord's end because the mill was powered by water and wind, which of course was free. So they're just trying to suck all the money they can from the peasants, and the Lords are very, very greedy. So Germany and East Central Europe had a little bit of a difference. They still had farming, but they also had iron, silver, lead, and copper mines. Germany became the main place for iron craftsmen. Blast furnaces were also invented to melt iron, and they were invented in 1380, so kind of in the middle of the Middle Ages. Metal was usually used for weapons, tools, coins, church bells, like you can see here, and statues. All right, so a little bit more about changes to the environment. So peasants under the rule of lords um, were ordered to drain wetlands and swamps. So of course that's going to change the environment. The reason why they did that is because wetlands and swamps have very fertile land typically underneath. Wind and water mills would change the flow of rivers, which of course is a change to an environment, and also debris from mines, blood and fat from slaughterhouses, acid from tanning, so when you like tan like animal hides, and human waste also polluted water. So the peasants had yummy, fatty, acidic, dusty water to drink, which probably explains why they only lived to be like 35 years old if they're lucky. Deforestation also occurred. What do you think the craftsmen needed the wood for? So, like you could probably imagine, building houses, shops, and ships. Leather tanners had to take tree bark and turn that into acid for tanning. That's what this dude is doing up here. Trees were also cut down for farmland and also charcoal. For every 40 days, a furnace would be running, so like a blast furnace. It needed 1 square kilometer of forest, like the wood from 1 kilometer of forest to run. So again, blast furnaces for iron and also glass making. All right, enough about peasants and the environment. Let's talk about the Franks. So we'll talk a lot about the Franks throughout Unit 7, but pretty much there's this group of people. They're mostly from what we would call modern day Germany and into France as well. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, what we see as like modern day Germany and France was not united. There were many small tribes that ruled small areas of land, and there was a constant change of leaders, and there was constant war until dun 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 this dude Clovis comes along. So here's the statue of Clovis. He only ruled 2 short years from 509 to 511. He was the king of a tribe of Germanic people called the Franks, and his wife Clothilde, yeah, okay, converted him to Christianity. So Clovis was battling a rival Germanic tribe and was losing, so he prayed to the Christian God, promising that if he won the battle, he would get baptized. So what do you think happened? Yes, that's right. He won and he kept good on his promise. So he and 3,000 of his soldiers got baptized. And the Catholic Church was pretty excited about this. And they were like, hey, Clovis, come here to Rome. I want to help you out. And again, remember, Rome is the capital of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church decides to support Clovis's military campaigns to defeat all of the Germanic tribes um, that had been trying to invade Rome. And by 511, Clovis has defeated all the Germanic tribes, and all the tribes in what like modern day Germany and parts of France are now ruled under one, which is King Clovis, and they became known as the Frank people. So, how do you think the Catholic Church spread Christianity to the Franks? So many parts of Europe were rural. Okay, there was no major cities with cathedrals, which are like large churches. So if you think of like major cities in Europe today, like let's say like London, um, that was nothing more than like a medium-sized village at this time. It was not a bustling city like we imagine today. So again, most of Europe was rural. And the church decided to build monasteries, help spread Christianity along the rural areas. So, what a monastery is a Christian communities that would include a church, and then they would include monks and priests who are male worship leaders, and nuns who would be like female holy followers. Monks, they led worship services. They copied books by hands, especially the Bible. The printing press has not been invented yet. That's not until the 1500s. So every book it would be written by hand. They also opened schools for male students, of course. And they would be historians, and they would also keep libraries archived. Nuns did have a significant role too. So again, nuns are like holy women. Just like priests and monks, they could not marry. They were educated primarily in the language of Latin, also arithmetic, grammar, music, morals, rhetoric, geometry, and astronomy. Because so women would become nuns for religious reasons mostly, but also let's say like their family was like, hey, daughter, you're going to marry this dude. And she was like, no. She would go and turn into a nun. So she didn't have to marry a guy she didn't want to, or she wanted to run away from her family. And they were also scholars and wrote their own religious theories. So one of the big things about the Christian church at this time was tithes. What tithes are is 1/10 of all the money profits or food grown by a person must be given to the church as a tax. So lords would have to give the church 1/10 of the food that the peasants grew. Craftsmen and others would give 1/10 of their monetary profit to the church. And this was in order to support church and its monks and nuns. Through monasteries, nuns and monks spread Christianity to the locals. A missionary is like a nun or a monk or just even an everyday Christian who goes to a non Christian land to spread the word of the Christian God. Christianity becomes very popular, not only in the places that once the Roman Empire ruled, but also beyond that, like to the north and like the Scandinavia. So the Catholic Church was centered in Rome, like I've said quite a few times now. More and more Christian followers meant that there was more and more power to the church. So in 590, Pope Gregory I declared the church secular. And what secular means that the church and its leaders have influence over politics across Europe. So that meant that the Pope would now be intermixed with both church and political affairs. An example of that would be a royal coronation. So here is a old picture of Queen Elizabeth, who was once the Queen of England, coronation. So when you think of coronation, what does the ceremony usually include? So it usually includes a crown, right? So it's when a person is crowned king or later on queen. They're given the crown of the kingdom. It usually has a high-ranking priest, or if you're in modern-day England, a minister who anoints the person. And it is both a political and a religious ceremony. All right, let's rewind to the Franks real quick. I was not done quite talking about them. So King Clovis. So remember, he's the guy who united all the Germanic tribes to be the Franks. He died in 511. By then, the Franks had the largest kingdom in Europe, and they were also BFFs with the Catholic Church. So again, here's kind of just a map showing everything in green is kind of showing the big extent of the Frankish kingdom. So after Clovis's death, the Frankish kingdom splits into four, because he had four sons. So then the kingdom would be split into four, like different sections. Blah blah blah. Anyway, all you need to know is that the kingdom would then again reunite into one by 700 under just one ruler. And it was due to this dude named Charles Martel, who comes into power in 719. But he comes to power in kind of a unique way because he is not actually the king. So, Charles Martel is the right hand man of King Pippin. And Charles Martel's title is something called the Mayor of the Palace. And King Pippin is just a figurehead. Charles Martel is actually the one with the power. So it's kind of like England today, right? Where the king is more of a figurehead, the person with the real power in England would be the prime minister. So it's kind of the same concept with the Franks. The king is the figurehead, the mayor of the palace is the dude with the real power. And in this case, it's going to be Charles Martel. So again, King Pepin is king. Charles Martel is the mayor of the palace. The mayor of the palace had the original duty of overseeing the workings of the palace, but by 719, the mayor of the palace like rules the country. So they rule the nobles, they make the laws, they control the military. So in other words, Martel has all the powers. So under Martel, he conquered modern-day France and then down south towards Spain. He also expanded east towards modern-day Austria. And in 732, he defeated a Spanish Muslim army, preventing the Muslim army from entering more of Europe. Actually, I think you'll see kind of a reenactment of his battle in the Dark Ages video. Anyway, So Charles Martel would then die in 741, and his son Pepin the Short becomes the mayor of the palace. But Pepin is not just satisfied with being the mayor of the palace, he also wants to be the king. Which again, mayor of the palace has the most power, king's just a figurehead, but he wanted both. So Pepin's like, hey, I really want to be the king. So he strikes a deal with the Catholic Church. The church has the power to make the Pepin king. And Pepin says he'll defeat the Lombards if the church makes him king. The Lombards were just a rabble group that wanted to invade the city of Rome. Again, that's the church's capital. So the church agrees. He defeats the Lombards, and Pepin becomes the king of the Franks. So Charles Martel, Pepin, and all of his descendants would be known as the Carolingian dynasty. And the Carolingian dynasty is a group of Frankish rulers who ruled the Frankish kingdom from 751 to 987, which is actually quite a long time that one family rules like a kingdom. Typically, there's a lot more murder and death involved. So again, you can kind of just see a flow chart here. So here's Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, right? He becomes king. Together they have a son named Charlemagne. You'll learn a lot about Charlemagne later on. So Pepin the Short dies in 768. The Frankish kingdom is then left to two sons, Carloman and Charles. Carloman died. Charles becomes the sole king, and then Charles changes his name to Charlemagne. But you'll learn more about Charlemagne in lesson 4. So here is the last thing you have to do. You need to summarize the Middle Ages in 5 sentences or bullet points. I know, I went through a lot, so 5 bullet points should be pretty easy. Just 5 things that you learned from the slideshow. So wrap up today, we learned about feudalism, peasants and lords, changes to the environment, the church during the Middle Ages, monks, nuns, the secular. We also learned about the Franks like Clovis, Charles Martel, who was the mayor of the palace, Pepin the Short, the Carolingian dynasty. Next up, we're going to do U7-L3, what was life like in the Middle Ages? So just to note, you would need to watch video A, okay? You need to watch video A and answer the question about it. And then after that, it's your choice of 2 of the 4 other videos to watch. And of course, if you want to watch all 5 and answer all the questions correctly, you can get extra credit points on the Unit 7 test. And then after you do the video choice, it is U7-L4, which is Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire Ed puzzle. And you're going to watch the Ed puzzle and answer the questions about it. If you have questions, email your teacher. If you want to learn more, email me. My office hours are Monday from 12 to 1. Mrs. Hinkle's are 2 to 3 on Wednesdays. Yeah, let us know if you have any questions. We're here to help you. If not, thanks for watching. Bye.